COVID-19 on women in the economy. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate, please to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Gillian Martin to open the debate.
Has adversely. Presiding Officer?
Yes, please carry on.
Okay,
we missed your first few words, but if you start it again, that'll be fine.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, there's no need to tell anyone that the past year has adversely affected every single one of us in Scotland. The hooks of COVID-19 have got into everyone in one way or another. Children haven't been able to go to school for very long, offices are closed, people have been ill, people have lost loved ones, and many have lost their livelihoods. We miss socialising with one another, and we crave a normal life where we can all get back to work, restart our lives, and stop juggling homeschooling with home working. We look forward to a future where surviving financially is in our own hands, and not based on the R number or the emergence of a new strain. But the fact is that women have been the worst affected by the pandemic, and all the inequalities that women were subjected to before have increased. I'd also suggest the effects could be long-lasting if we don't factor them in to our recovery as a priority. If I were to make the statement that women are more likely to be in precarious work and low-paid jobs, it could be a statement from 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Let's add that other truism in that women are most likely to be the main carer for children and older relatives. And let's also add in the indisputable fact that women still do most of the unpaid labour of maintaining a home and feeding a family. But I'm saying it now, and I'm also adding in a pandemic. COVID restrictions have affected everyone, but they have put more pressure on women in particular. We know from reports from equalities organisations and personal testimonies that the woman in the household is the most likely to be the one who gives up her job or business if the extra responsibilities that come with COVID get too much. I know many couples take equal responsibility, but sadly it's just not the case in the majority. The Institute of Fiscal Studies found that in the first lockdown, mothers did on average 50% more unpaid childcare and housework than fathers. Let's also not forget the vast majority of single-parent households are run by women who also have jobs or businesses. And women are more likely to be in the front line in COVID, working in health and social care and in supermarkets, exposing themselves to the virus more than anyone else. Presiding Officer, we all know the existing inequalities of the burden of unpaid care, the gender pay gap and the persistent gender-segregated employment. But what a different experience this pandemic would have been for women if more serious effort had been made by society to eradicate all of those inequalities. But we are where we are, and I do want to use my time today to point to ways in which we in Scotland can help focus our recovery in stemming the widening equality gap. Before the pandemic, Scotland was on the cusp of doubling free childcare. We owe it to women in particular to make this a priority once the lockdowns end. For those of us who want to go further and expand free childcare in the same manner of our Northern European counterparts, we must look again at the fiscal levers needed to facilitate that. If we have them already, and we have some, but by no means all, we should use them to expand. If we need more of those powers here, then every single party who believes in free childcare expansion and gender equality must morally get behind the call for the increased tax powers that other countries use to fund their 100% provision. I also think we need to take a serious look at how we can get employment law devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and I hope to see every party leader stand strongly behind having the most effective levers of fair work in our own hands. In particular, I would like to see the compulsion of the gender pay gap reporting stem from this Parliament and be strengthened to include more businesses and compel companies to produce an action plan if they fall short. I would also be supportive of workers with caring responsibilities have the right to request agile and flexible working where appropriate, and a compulsion on organisations prove that they have given it serious consideration and made every effort to facilitate it. I also believe that we need to harness the very few positive things which life with COVID has taught us. It turns out we can work remotely. We don't need to commute in traffic jams. We can be trusted to get on with our work without being in a physical workplace, being watched over by managers. With a bit of help, we can balance work and family life with little or no detriment to either. But we need to take targeted action now to make women central to the recovery, and women must not hesitate. Together with my colleagues in Women's Enterprise Scotland, I have been engaging with women business owners throughout this period and hearing testimony on how the types of businesses that are women-run have been hardest hit. Close working businesses such as fitness, hair and beauty, hospitality, tourism and events, catering and retail. These are the lifeblood of women's role in the enterprise sector in Scotland. Women sole traders make a huge contribution to our economy. Yet sole traders were almost ignored by the UK government in the first wave of support. The Scottish Government has stepped in and has provided newly self-employed schemes, targeted sectoral support, is rolling out a close working package, and has enabled local authorities to give out discretionary funding to those which other sectoral funding packages may have missed. But in the recovery, we need to do everything possible to bring those women who have lost their businesses completely or have made decisions to quit due to other pressures. We need to bring them back into business. I think government borrowing is going to be essential for that. We have to be able to target our resources into ensuring a generation of women entrepreneurs find their way back, and better access to finance has to be part of that. I'm very encouraged that so many members have offered to speak in today's debate, and I know that many members have been contacted by women in their constituencies with their stories and their key asks, and I look forward to hearing what they are. My thanks go out in particular to Close the Gap, the Women's Budget Group and Women's Enterprise Scotland. And I'm also indebted to Dr Noreen Arshed of the University of Dundee, whose excellent blog for the Scottish Parliament Research Centre is a vital read for anyone interested in how the pandemic has affected women's business. In closing, Presiding Officer, I want to stress one key thing. Women's financial parity is good for an economy. Let's prioritise everything we can to closing that gender pay gap and help women back into business and fair work to help us recover as a country. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Ruth Maguire to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by congratulating Gillian Martin for securing this debate and bringing this important topic to the Chamber, and thank her for all her hard work she does in raising awareness of these issues. Presiding Officer, as the pandemic continues to affect lives and livelihoods, we can already see the regressive effects on women's equality. A disproportionate number of women are managing additional demands at home, at work and family life. And as we learned from the Ebola outbreak, gendered norms mean that women are more likely to be infected by the virus, given their predominant role as caregivers within families and as frontline workers in health, social care and education. We all know that the virus doesn't specifically target women, that restrictions affect parts of the economy which are largely represented by women. Michaela Williams is one of many of my constituents who have contacted me for help during this period. Michaela is a self-employed complementary therapist with a husband and a 4-year-old child. During the first lockdown, Michaela was eligible for the furlough scheme. However, circumstances meant that she had no choice but to take on a temporary job with a supermarket. As restrictions were lifted, she was pleased to reopen her business. Now Michaela has had to close again. With her husband unable to be furloughed and with the closure of school and nurseries, she's struggling to find childcare to allow her to attend her employment. Having exhausted all options, she's having to think about resigning. As reported by Engender, Michaela is a clear example of the differential effect the closure of schools is having on women, with the consequence of limiting their work and economic opportunities. It particularly affects lone parents, 90% of whom are women, due to the difficulties of working from home or finding employment. Additionally, research by Close the Gap shows that there's been an increase in the numbers of women who are in predominantly female industries, such as beauty, cleaning, childcare, and are self-employed with no access to statutory employment rights. In addition, assessment to financial support for self-employed women can be inherently unequal. Gemma Neal is an eyelash technician in my constituency with a 14-month-old child. She applied for the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, which took into consideration her maternity leave. Gemma was assessed to receive £400 every 3 months. And I think we can all agree that that's simply not enough income to support a child and live on. As convener of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee, it was crucial to me that we proceeded with an inquiry on the impact of the pandemic, and prior to the budget, considering what groups and individuals were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and what measures should be taken to minimise negative impact on equalities and human rights. Now, the committee has been pursuing gender budgeting and distributional analysis for the best part of this parliamentary session. Each parliamentary year, the committee receives submissions and hear evidence on the need for the Scottish Government to take account of the impact of tax raising and spending decisions on women specifically. This year has been no exception. In fact, COVID-19 has further compounded the urgency to address these issues. Furthermore, the Scottish Women's Budget Group highlighted decisions to delay increased provision of early years childcare and the implementation of the Scottish Child Payment are likely to have had a disproportionate impact on women, particularly single-parent households. Spending on childcare and social care must be treated as infrastructure spending. Yes, to support the realisation of women's equality and rights, but this is not just about fairness to women. More equal societies are better for everyone. Presiding Officer, as we continue to endure this pandemic, we must have a focus on enhancing women's economic position. Without taking a gendered approach that recognises the reality of women's lives, it's likely that women's equality and rights will remain disadvantaged and may even slip backwards. It has been shown that what's good for women's equality is good for the economy. Ignoring the position of women is not an option. We have all the information and evidence we need to deliver meaningful and measurable change for women, for Scotland. Add to that the right political will and we can make a real difference. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, and I call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I also want to thank Gillian Martin for bringing this important issue to the Chamber today. We all know how tough the past year has been, and without a doubt the impact has been more pronounced for women. Whether it is homeschooling, the responsibility of caring, holding down a job or running a business, or indeed, in some cases, juggling all four, women have been disproportionately impacted. Entrenched gender inequalities are systemic across every aspect of the economy, and it continues to create an uneven playing field. The pandemic has genuinely exacerbated this, and I resonate with the example that Ruth Maguire gave, mirroring a similar situation I had with a constituent, a single mother who had to quit her job because she wasn't classed as a key worker and wasn't able to work from home. We have to remember that whilst today we are focusing on women, there are many other inequalities that are worsening due to COVID, such as health inequalities associated with BAME communities and the disability employment gap. A TUC report found that the employment rate for disabled women is 53.2% compared to 75% for non-disabled women, and the Scottish Conservatives are committed to seeing this gap narrowed. Presiding Officer, I was pleased to welcome the Unequal Impact Coronavirus and the Gendered Economic Impact report published on the 26th of January, compiled by the Women and Equalities Committee at Westminster, which seeks to address these issues that we are talking about today. It acknowledges that the UK government acted quickly to design and implement schemes to protect jobs with the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and Self-Employment Income Support Scheme. These UK-wide schemes have provided vital safety nets to millions of people, including thousands of women across Scotland. Yet it does remain the case that despite these measures, women continue to be disproportionately affected. HMRC statistics show that in most countries and regions, more women than men were furloughed as of the 31st of July last year. Engender highlighted this too, and during lockdown, mothers have reduced the paid work
they do compared to fathers, and already 1.5 times more likely than fathers to have lost their jobs or to have quit their jobs over lockdown. In their report, Gender and Unpaid Work estimate that the impact of mothers' lost earnings or productivity as a result is a staggering £15 million lost to the economy every day in Scotland. And these stark figures are underpinned by a recent McKinsey report that states that despite women making up 39% of employment globally, overall job losses amongst females have accounted for 54%, with women's jobs 1.8 times more vulnerable to the current crisis than men. And moreover, the IFS estimated that women were a third more likely to be employed in sectors that were shut down. They were also at a higher risk of job loss. Employment such as retail and hospitality, as highlighted by Gillian Martin, have been and continue to be adversely affected. I say gently. It does not help when governments fail to recognise that businesses who employ women are on their knees. Next week, we will see burdensome licensing regulations brought forward by this government without an impact study on how this would adversely affect women from Aberdeenshire to the Scottish borders, those who perhaps operate a B&B to top up their income. We all know many of those women. This, combined with insufficient grant funding and awkward application criteria, has resulted in many female business owners struggling to protect their livelihoods in Scotland. And I believe that a lot more could be done to protect women in business through speedy payment of grant funding, an adaptation period, more targeted funding to support sectors on which women rely heavily for that income. Also, presiding officer, many young people have been adversely affected, many young women finding it difficult to find jobs leaving high school or to go into a slumping economy as we're seeing right now. And the number of young people claiming unemployment-related benefits has increased by 122% between March and July. We've got to recognise that there is a greater need to place equality at the heart of employment interventions to support women returners to work. And on International Day of Women in Science, women continue to be underestimated in STEM modern apprenticeships, and we must take bolder action to recruit, retain and progress women across STEM. In conclusion, as the green shoots start to emerge from this pandemic, we must not forget the impact on women. We cannot ignore that women continue to experience inequalities, and that is why we should ensure we tackle this gender bias to support the next generation of women who play a key role in building back our economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Joan McAlpine to be followed by Elaine Smith.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I also welcome this debate, and I also thank Gillian Martin for her motion, which draws attention to a critical issue. Before the arrival of COVID-19, women already experienced widespread economic inequality. For example, in regard to the labour market participation, income and living standards, and the pandemic has only exacerbated that inequality. A vast amount of research, much of which has been quoted by others already, demonstrates that the lockdown measures, necessary as they are to keep us all safe, have had a disproportionate long-term impact on women, especially working class women, significant numbers of whom now face redundancy and job losses. Though furlough rates for men and women have been similar, analysis by HMRC shows that men placed on the job retention scheme have been more likely to be retained by their employer than women. The highest rates of furlough have been in two female-dominated sectors, retail and hospitality, both of which are characterised by low pay and job insecurity. 2/3 of workers who earn less than the living wage are women, and that means that they only receive 80% of their usual income being furloughed, which clearly puts them well into the poverty area. Lone parents, of which 91% are women, are especially likely to struggle to combine childcare and paid work, and are much more likely to be in debt and financially vulnerable. We know that single income households are more likely to be in poverty and less likely to have someone to share childcare responsibilities. It's startling to note that the Gender Inequality Index finds that 85% of people aged 16 to 64 who are economically inactive due to caring responsibilities are women. The closure of schools and nurseries has inevitably resulted in increased care demands, and this increase in unpaid housework and care is a significant factor in women exiting the workforce. I would also say that when we look at carers of people who have disabilities, they are also disproportionately likely to be female, and we know that many, I've raised this in the chamber before, but with many disabled people losing their support packages, it's women who have to step in and take over the caring responsibilities there. And I've been dealing with a lady in my own constituency who has a very important role as an essential worker and is also a carer for her adult sister, and the day centre was withdrawn, and that essential worker has just been left with this very significant caring responsibility, with no thought for her welfare at all, and that's repeated all over the country. It's very difficult for women to balance home working with childcare. And there's a lack of flexible jobs, and that poses a significant barrier to employment and progression for women compared to men. According to research from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, women with caring responsibilities in paid work have reduced their paid working hours substantially during the pandemic, and 78% of unpaid carers report having to provide more care than they were prior to the coronavirus outbreak. The IFS data also shows that mothers who have left paid work over lockdown are continuing to do twice as much domestic work as their partners. By contrast, where a father stops working in an opposite-sex couple, they tend to share the childcare even when the mother is still doing 5 hours of paid work a day on top. The extent of unpaid work is a key determinant of women's capacity to take part in the formal labour market, and it's essential that additional support is provided for women with caring responsibilities. As we look towards recovery, we have talked a great deal about a greener, fairer future. While women are disadvantaged in this way, it cannot be a fairer future for all. We should measure the progress of a community by the degree of progress which women have achieved. The pandemic has set back much of that progress, and we have much work to do, and we must measure what we do if women are to make up the ground which COVID has stolen from them. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, and I now call Elaine Smith to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and like others, can I thank Gillian Martin for bringing this debate to the Chamber, and also refer members to my Register of Interest, recording that I'm an unremunerated Director of McQuick Limited and a member of Unite. There's no doubt that the impact of the pandemic has been felt differently across our society, and the evidence all points towards growing inequalities. And that runs counter to the founding principles of our Scottish Parliament. And politicians from across the Chamber have raised all sorts of concerns about weaknesses and gaps in policy responses to the pandemic on behalf of women in our constituencies. And looking at the impact of the economic and public health crisis on women, I want to refer colleagues to the UK Parliament Women Inequalities Committee report published on Tuesday this week and already mentioned by Rachel Hamilton in her contribution. In the report, Unequal Impact, Coronavirus and the Gendered Economic Impact, the committee leaves us in no doubt that the UK government has failed to date to look at the differential impact of key COVID-19 interventions on women. The furlough scheme, the support for small business, the new initiatives around Kickstart and also in green recovery show no sign of understanding the need for impact assessments and strong mitigating measures. The UK committee calls for the DWP to conduct research to understand the gendered impact of the design of universal credit, and it adds the committee's voice to the call, which many of us support, for the extension of the £20 increase in the universal credit allowance to continue beyond the end of March, because undoubtedly without extending that £20 top up, it's women that will go hungry, it's women whose health will suffer, and it's women who'll be cold and ill prepared for the bad weather, because women will always make feeding their children the priority. Presiding Officer, two excellent effective national campaigning organisations, Maternity Action and Pregnant Then Screwed, have welcomed the recommendations that the UK government should urgently bring forward legislation to extend redundancy protection to pregnant women and new mothers. And I'm sure that pregnant women and new mothers here in Scotland will have had the same experience: increased discrimination, losing work, breaks in contracts and isolation for new mums. This debate today needs to focus on these issues as experienced by women in Scotland. Mitigating measures can be taken here, and the trade unions and the Fair Work agenda must be at the centre of the response. For example, we should ensure that procurement and commissioning contracts protect women and provide sufficient budgets for full maternity cover. And this could also be a chance to rethink the childcare packages on offer. The commitments on provision of childcare for 3 to 5-year-olds was certainly welcomed by Scottish Labour, but for many mothers, support is needed well before a child reaches the age of 3. And the economic infrastructure needs good care infrastructure, a point well made earlier by Ruth Maguire. That would provide jobs and career opportunities for women in the social care and childcare sectors, but undoubtedly childcare and support for babies and toddlers needs to be moved up our agenda. I would ask the Minister who's responding to give an indication of what specific consideration is being given to those women falling out of the labour market due to lack of support whilst pregnant and in those early years. And of course, Labour would be happy to work on a cross-party basis on identifying the measures that can be taken in Scotland with the powers that rest here at the moment to maximise support for new mothers and their families. Presiding Officer, I briefly also wish to highlight the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights report on the ethnicity and poverty in Scotland 2020, which observed that poverty strategies seldom integrate the experience of black and ethnic minority communities. Recognising the impact of the pandemic on women must also then recognise these points. The pre-pandemic 2019 employment gap figures showed that the minority ethnic employment gap was much higher for women than for men. Returning to the Westminster Select Committee, that report also emphasises the importance of improving data collection by sex. Understanding any differential impact of both the disease and the response to the pandemic on women and men is essential if we're to tackle sex inequality. Indeed, in a response to a question from me on the 3rd of March 2020, nearly a year ago, seeking assurance on the importance of disaggregating data by sex, the Cabinet Secretary for Health assured me that the Scottish Government recognised this and would feed this view into the UK data collection plans too. Presiding Officer, given that we've heard at Westminster this week and in this debate, there's clearly much to do to develop policies which recognise that reversing these growing inequalities for women in Scotland is a matter of urgency. And once again, I congratulate Gillian Martin for securing the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Rona Mackay to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to contribute to this important debate, and I thank my colleague Gillian Martin for bringing it to the Chamber. As others have said, COVID-19 has been terrible for everyone. None of us have ever experienced anything like it, and when this is over, which will hopefully be soon, I hope none of us ever have to go through anything like it again. But there's no doubt that women are disproportionately affected, whether it's juggling with working at home, supervising home learning, or simply by having their employment disrupted. As the helpful briefing from Close the Gap tells us, women make up 77% of key workers in social care, early years in childcare, nursing and in supermarkets, but they are grossly undervalued, underpaid and underprotected. Women are also more likely to work in shut-down sectors such as hospitality and retail, and this is especially the case for BAME women and younger women. Older women too are being impacted by the pandemic. The WASPI women, who suffered one of the greatest injustices to women I can remember when the UK government withheld their pension without notice, have suffered a huge increase in unemployment. And perversely, many WASPI women over 65 who are still working are in the at-risk category but are required to keep on working, again often in the frontline roles of nursing, care and retail, as they now have no pension which would allow them to retire. Data shows that since July 2020, women have accounted for the majority of furloughed workers in Scotland. Presiding Officer, gender inequality has never been more exposed than during this pandemic. When the pandemic is over, we must not go back to the old way of working, with women being disadvantaged in the workplace and overworked at home. This is a huge subject, too huge to be tackled in a short debate, but it is clear that we've reached a watershed and we must move towards a gender equal economy and start making plans for that now. A recent survey on work and mental health during the pandemic revealed that workers from all sectors and backgrounds were struggling to cope with increased workload and separating work and home life. One woman said, I felt like I had 2020 responsibilities at work and 1950s home responsibilities. I didn't want my daughter to see that it's always mum that does these things. Of course, we all have male family members and friends who take equal share of domestic responsibilities. But as we've heard, evidence from the Institute of Fiscal Studies found that in the first lockdown, mothers did on average 50% more unpaid childcare and housework than fathers. Enough is enough. This debate has demonstrated vividly why we need to change a society that takes women for granted at all levels. This is 2021. Our daughters and granddaughters deserve a fairer future, and they deserve to be recognised as equals in everything that they do. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, and I call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And thank you to Gillian Martin, who's taken the lead on many occasions in this Parliament on the issue of women. I'm pleased to support her debate. And I have always supported the view that employment law should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, so I support that too. The great speeches I think we've heard this afternoon, highlighting women with disabilities that Joan McAlpine did, BME women that Elaine Smith did, and older women that Ronan Mackay did there, it's important also to talk about the diversity of women in our communities. Because we know that women are carrying the burden of this crisis, with many having to juggle with work and caring responsibilities, putting themselves selflessly before others and risking themselves working on the front line of this health crisis. It's women who are more likely to bear the brunt of the social and economic consequences of the pandemic, as virtually all the previous speakers have said. Concerningly, the United Nations General Secretary has warned that COVID-19 could reverse the limited progress that has been made on gender equality and women's rights. Women started this crisis from a position of economic disadvantage, and the pandemic has only served to deepen this. They are more likely to be in precarious, low-paid work than men, and data from the Resolution Foundation shows that only 1 in 10 lower earners are able to work from home, and over 2/3, 69% of low earners are women, and that's quite staggering when you think of this pandemic. And those of us who have been able to work from time to time from home will learn that the vast majority of women and low-paid workers have not been able to do this. So it's no surprise that women have borne the brunt of unemployment caused by the pandemic. A report by the Institute of Fiscal Studies found that mothers in the UK were 1.5 times more likely than fathers to have either quit their job or lost it during lockdown. We know that women's work is undervalued, and for many women that have retained their jobs, women's work is systematically and continues to be undervalued. And this contributes in a large part to the gender pay gap, and this is often a discrepancy in the pay in jobs requiring similar education and responsibility. We know that women make up 80% of key workers in care and early years, childcare, nursing, and in our supermarkets. Not much has really changed over the years. Unfortunately, these jobs are undervalued and underpaid. We need to change that. More than half of social care workers putting their health at risk during the coronavirus outbreak are paid less than the real living wage, according to the Resolution Foundation. And the real living wage outside London is £9.30 an hour, and staff in that sector are 4 times more likely to be on a 0 hours contract than the average worker. Since the start of the pandemic, there has been a surge in calls for those working in care to be better appreciated and crucially better paid. I think we've all had our eyes opened in these times about the work that care workers do generally, and I hope that will change forever in the future. Oxfam sent a briefing for this debate noting the surge in caring responsibilities caused by COVID and calling for action to end the systematic undervaluing of care work as a national priority, and that I agree. And just last week, the independent review of adult social care in Scotland recommended the establishment of a national care service, whether the Scottish ministers do need to take accountability for the delivery of social care. We need a care service that puts people before profit. I think there's a consensus on that now, and we want to see, that's Scottish Labour that is, a pay increase for care workers to £15 an hour. For those women who are able to work from home, many have the added pressure of homeschooling. Trying to homeschool even one child, let alone several, while attempting to work is an incredible burden that we place on families. And women say it's almost impossible to finish any task because they've had to deal with the constant interruptions. They're forced to either ignore their kids or stop getting their work done. And I know one mother who says that she feels like she's failing at everything. because she's trying to juggle with so much, and it's unfair to be placed in this situation on a daily basis. There's a pressing need to look at a refreshed national childcare provision to ensure that we don't roll back on women's rights and their ability to progress their careers. As Close the Gap reminds us, there is a significant risk that the increase in caring responsibilities will force many women to leave their jobs, affecting their income and their career prospects, and ultimately placing women and their children at great risk of poverty. I know in these debates, Presiding Officer, women in this Parliament have debated these issues over the last 5 years, and I think between us we have set out the challenges for whichever women represent their communities in the next Parliament. I'm really pleased and proud to be part of Gillian Martin's debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I call Claire Adamson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank Gillian Martin for securing this important debate this afternoon, and for the many considered, informative and heartfelt experiences laid out by my MSP colleagues this afternoon. They've covered many of what I might have spoken about, so I'll move on and hopefully not repeat some of the great messages that we've already heard this afternoon. It was over 20 years ago when I studied economics as part of my degree. I first became aware of Marilyn Waring and her seminal book, If Women Counted. At the time, it shook the core of economic theory and perceived wisdom. This book was influential in tackling the methodology of international standards of measuring economic growth. It challenged why travel to work was an economic activity, but caring responsibilities were not. The book persuaded the United Nations to redefine gross domestic product. It inspired new accounting methods across the world and brought feminist economics to the mainstream audience. Indeed, J.K. Galbraith said of it, "No concerned man or woman can ignore it." And this debate should be of concern to everyone, as it is essential to the economic success and the well-being of our nation. 20 years ago, this book changed our view of work. And we can be glad of that. The very fact that the gender index referenced in the motion by Ms Martin exists is a testament to the impact of Marilyn Waring. Her parliamentary career in New Zealand, which framed its country's values and influenced exceptional policies on equal pay, on environmental issues, and she was pivotal in the declaration of a nuclear-free New Zealand, give us an example that we should aspire to. It's what can be achieved with leadership and political will. Today we look at the advances in gender equality in New Zealand as an example of the possible. There is absolutely no doubt that the challenges outlined by Ms Martin and many of my colleagues in the Chamber this afternoon are understood. But we talk often about the symptoms, but it's the underlying causes, the societal inequality, the gendered roles that exist and which COVID has only exacerbated and laid before us. It is right that they have been brought to the Chamber. Presiding Officer, as mentioned, it is the United Nations Women in Science Day. As a scientist who's spoken in this chamber many times about the underrepresentation of women in STEM, and perhaps even more worrying, the endemic sexism that has led to the leaky pipe of women leaving science professions, as highlighted by the Royal Society of Edinburgh Tapping All Our Talents report, updated just in 2018, we cannot let this fall from view and fall for political attention. We must do better in recognising the contribution of women in our professions, in the workplace, in their daily lives as they undertake caring responsibilities, and we must recognise that their work counts and that low pay around gendered employment is a systemic sexism that must be tackled, and it leads to economic disadvantage that will last a lifetime, with lower pensions following a lifetime of lower pay. And as we reflect on the impact of COVID in our communities, it's clear to see that women are engaged in key worker duties, many of which, as have already been spoken about, are also laid out erroneously as being low skilled. I see the impact also on BAME women and understand the economic and societal economic disadvantage that surrounds us, and reflects that those in jobs that we truly can't function without need to be valued and recognised as we come out of this pandemic. My own experience as a counsellor painfully reminds me of the failure of the job evaluation exercises across Scotland that saw the very system put in place to undo some of these wrongs is still undervaluing women's work and leading to more systemic inequality. Organisations paid by women to represent their interests sometimes let them down, and it took years for this to be put right, most recently by the Equal Pay Awards in Glasgow. Not exclusively to women, but mainly to women. If I could highlight just one of those symptoms of economic equality and the gender pay gap at a national level, and to include New Zealand in our comparisons, I have to move away from the EU index and look to the OECD. In their most recent report in 2018, the UK had a gap of 16.4%, New Zealand 7.9%, Ireland 5.9%, and Denmark 5.3%. One could easily draw the conclusion that small populations similar to Scotland and small countries with complete economic levers of a normal country are in a far better situation to move towards gender equality and well-being, something we should all be aspiring to. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I now call Minister Jamie Hepburn to respond to and wind up the debate. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin by joining others in thanking Gillian Martin for tabling the motion that we've debated this afternoon, and indeed thanking other members who have taken part for their contributions. Presiding Officer, let me state at the outset of my contribution that I recognise the impact the pandemic has had on women in the Scottish economy. I wholeheartedly agree that we must ensure that the position of women is properly considered and that they are properly supported as part of our economic recovery as we come through and out of COVID-19. And how could we do anything else in these uncertain times when women have been undertaking the majority of frontline roles that were rightly recognised as essential, but we must recognise undertaken mainly by women, those in social care and retail that Gillian Martin mentioned as she opened the debate this afternoon. I want to join with others in recognising the work done by those organisations that powerfully articulate the voices of women in matters related to the economy, but in particular both Close the Gap and in gender. Their work has helped inform our understanding and approach to tackling the key issues affecting women during this pandemic. Both organisations have contributed to developing our gender index, and both also participate in the Gender Pay Gap Working Group that I chair. The group have recently looked to repurpose some of the actions that we laid out in our Gender Pay Gap Action Plan with a specific eye making sure that they are appropriate and they're correct actions to respond to the impact of COVID-19, and I can let members know that an update on these actions will be published in March. I've always been clear that there is work to be done on this area, and it remains clear that this continues to be the case. Lillian Smith was quite correct to make that point. And we should acknowledge and recognise that the pandemic has the potential to damage women's employment opportunities longer term and increase the gender pay gap in coming years. With the division of caring responsibilities we know exist and persist, itself a challenge that we have to take head on. Women can be particularly impacted and put under pressure by things such as school closures, increased care commitments, which it may make it harder to maintain or undertake employment. The return of children to early learning and childcare and school is a priority for this government. That will, of course, exist. And I'm also glad that the UK government reviewed the guidance on the job retention scheme to make it clear that parents can be furloughed if they need to look after their children where schools are shut. And I encourage all employers to support their employees' needs in whatever way is required. That's something we made very clear through the Fair Work Statement on COVID-19 that we jointly signed with other organisations such as the Scottish Trades Union Congress. I will of course be gladder still if and when the UK Government announce an extension to the job retention scheme, which we know has been and should continue to be a key response to supporting people, enabling the retention of employment during the pandemic. If then also we know that flexible working can be another mechanism to support those with caring, homeschooling or other commitments. Indeed, COVID-19 has brought a rapid move to flexible working and working from home wherever possible, albeit not in the ideal circumstances where people can take advantage of working from home. The Scottish Government has funded Flexibility Works and Time-wise to provide advice and support to a range of businesses and employment organisations in flexible and home working to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. We also continue to support employers to advance equality in the workplace through our Workplace Equality Fund. Our recent round of funding is currently supporting 12 projects with over £300,000 of investment, some of which is focused on supporting women enter, remain and progress in work. And through our Women in Enterprise framework, we are fully committed to tackling the entrepreneurial gender gap and continue to support a range to do this. This includes supporting the Ambassadors programme with Women's Enterprise Scotland, who I thank for their work, and includes investing in Women's Accelerate Her programme, supporting female-led companies to access finance and support. We have, of course, also allocated up to £50 million for a newly self-employed hardship fund for those who were failed by the UK Government's self-employed income support scheme. The second round of funding will open for applications shortly. And I mention that because I think there were a number of members who made very apposite and appropriate remarks about the need to support those women who have in many circumstances been compelled to take on forms of self-employment by virtue of their circumstances. We will support those newly self-employed who were missed out through the UK Government supports them. Also, our range of employability support interventions recognise the increasing challenges we're likely to see in the labour market, and in particular on women. Members can be assured that those interventions are being developed and delivered with fair work and equality of opportunity and inclusion as a central aim. A key element of our fair work activity is action to tackle the gender pay gap and create more diverse and inclusive workplaces. We are acting to support women in the labour market. Our Women Returners programme supports women who have had a career break back into work. Projects focus on women with multiple barriers. 12 projects have been funded recently, with some such as the Returners to Finance programme supporting women in Aberdeen and the North East, a focus on a part of the country that I'm sure Gillian Martin will welcome. And indeed she will also, I'm sure, welcome the Energy Transition Zone in Aberdeen, creating around 8,000 training opportunities, building on the offshore wind skills mapping exercise to encourage and support women and others into employment. Presiding Officer, we are also increasing the Parental Employability Support Fund by a further £2.35 million, bringing in year investment to £7.35 million in total. This fund targets priority groups such as lone parents, whom we know, of course, that, as Ruth Maguire mentioned, the vast majority are women. And of course, our Young Persons Guarantee, our National Transition Training Fund, our Employability Programme Fair Start Scotland, our Employability Fund, Community Jobs Scotland, and our No One Left Behind activity will all have a huge role to play in supporting women in the Scottish economy as we recover from COVID-19. Presiding Officer, through these activities and our wider approach to economic recovery, we will, I believe, make a difference to supporting and improving the position of women in the labour market through COVID-19. But I don't want it felt by members that I've ended with a litany of self-congratulatory statements about what we are doing as a government. I do believe that what I've laid out, the direction we've set out, will contribute positively. I do return to that point I made earlier. I do recognise there is much more still to be done. So those who've contributed today, and just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, women across the length and breadth of Scotland, be sure that in that recognition there is a determination to do just that, to do much more. My priority is that as a government we will continue to ensure that we work concertedly to ensure women are not disadvantaged by COVID-19. But once again, I thank Gillian Martin for bringing forward her motion today. I thank other members for their contribution.
Thank you very much. That concludes this debate on the impact of COVID-19 on women in the economy. And I now hand over to my colleague Christine Graham to take forward the next item of business.
Thank you.